it was hard being a woman in the 19th century, even in wealthy circles. Consider, there was no safety net. If a husband died, the wife often found herself suddenly poor and needing to rely on the welfare of other family members. Or if she had some education, she might be able to take on a few students as a tutor. But sometimes it meant going out and finding a menial job, or in some cases, taking on, shall we say, male visitors. Women were often at the mercy of their husbands or other male relatives. They could be denied money or have access to their social outlets limited. They did not have standing in the judicial system. There was no divorce based upon violent behavior or non-support. Women just had to live, and we have many stories of it. Women just had to live with husbands who drank to the excess and did not take care of their families, or decided on a whim to go off and to climb mountains or do something like that and leave the family. Now, women of the upper or middle class were caught up in what historian Barbara Welter named the cult of true womanhood. The idea that the ideal woman would be pious, pure, submissive, and domestic. Life was to be centered around the church, the house, and the husband, or other male members of the family. Middle and upper class women could help out with a family business, or perhaps be a private tutor, or earn what's called pin money, working in the home, doing knitting and crochet work that they could sell to their neighbors, or baking pastries or making small little dinners that they could sell to their neighbors. They could do this without raising the eyebrows of other women as having improper behavior. Now, however, this norm for middle class and upper class women, the norm was that they would spend their time taking care of their husband, their home, and their children. Now, they could be educated and they could study so long as that did not interfere with the housework. It was thought that serious study of any subject would be harmful to the family and very dangerous to the woman, physically and mentally. There are articles by physicians that if a woman studied too much, she may not be able to bear children and could ultimately go mad. Women were understood to exert their influence through the home, as Harriet Beecher Stowe described in her writing Treatise on Domestic Economy, when she said, "In civil and political affairs, American women take no interest or concern, except so far as they sympathize with their family and personal friends." Women were to create a moral citizenry imbued with Protestant evangelical beliefs. Remember, this is the time at the early part of the 19th century is when we had the Second Great Awakening. It was believed that nature had dictated that men were naturally suited for the public world and women for the private. Now, the interesting thing is this cultural norm did not apply to women of lower economic status or immigrants. They were allowed to work outside their home, and they were not expected to bring forth the Protestant work ethic because they probably were Catholic. These women, of course, were not held in high regard by other women or by society in general. Yet, out of this environment of precarious economics and social repression came several irrepressible women who, by their sheer will, broke ground for other women in their time, and laid the foundation for cultural shifts that would change the country over the next several decades. These are the Transcendentalist women. Now, when I say Transcendentalist women, I mean the group of women whose words and actions exemplified their Transcendentalist philosophy. So at the core, this is just a quick review. At the core of Transcendentalist philosophy is the belief in the inherent goodness of people, deep appreciation for the wondrous gift of nature, and the conviction that people are at their best when truly self-reliant and independent. It rejected the notion that human knowledge comes just through the senses. Adherents to this philosophy held to the idea that internal spiritual principles were the basis for people comprehending the world. These spiritual principles form the basis for the consciousness or for intuition that made it possible for the mind to be open and to move above and beyond, transcend the mundane world that we are forced to live in. Now, a person did not practice transcendentalism as one practices Buddhism or Christianity, but rather held a philosophy of individualism, of self-actualization, though they didn't use that term, self-actualization, equality, the power of nature, and the importance of beauty as their guideposts, as the philosophy by which they tried to live. And for their time, their political and social statements were as forward-thinking and as controversial as those of any woman today, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, or the Capital Sisters International CEO, Patricia Foley-Heinen, who has found a way to use traditional financing methods and to go into the boardrooms to get money to finance thousands of women's micro-businesses in 23 countries around the world. Through their actions and writings, these Transcendentalist women influenced many thousands of women for many decades in the middle and late 19th century to campaign against slavery and then for women's rights. And what is also interesting is that their influence was not just confined to women. These individuals had direct impact on the thinking of men like Henry David Thoreau, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and William Ellery Channing, who became abolitionists as a result of their involvement with these Transcendentalist women. So we probably all know the women we're going to be talking about on this Women's Sunday, Women's Month History Sunday. I want to sort of reintroduce us to a few of these women. The first woman I want to reintroduce us to is Mary Moody Emerson. Mary Emerson lived a bit before the Transcendentalist movement was fully developed. So we can probably say that she was a proto-transcendentalist. But she had a major influence on one of the great transcendentalist thinkers, Ralph Waldo Emerson. Though she herself received very little formal education, she read voraciously. She read the Bible, she read Milton, she read Jonathan Edwards, she read Cicero and Wordsworth and Spinoza and Byron. And then she thought deeply about what she had read, and she thought deeply about what she saw around her in nature. And then she journaled daily for most of her 90 years. She journaled daily, recording her thoughts in what she called her almanacs. Ralph read her almanacs when he was a little boy, and then read them throughout his life, even after Mary died. And many of the ideas that Mary expressed in her essays appear in his essays, such as Nature and the Oversoul. She influenced, she influenced one of the greatest Transcendentalist thinkers. The educational concept of kindergarten, as we heard in our reading, came to the United States thanks to the Transcendentalist Elizabeth Peabody. Buddhist thought was brought into America with Elizabeth's English translation of the Lotus Sutra, which was the first to be published in this country. Elizabeth had an important connection with our William Ellery Channing. She was first his governess and then became his assistant, editing and getting published over 200 of his sermons. We also know about Nathaniel Hawthorne because she was the person, as his publicist, who got him to step out of his shell and to publish his works. She was the business manager and the editor of The Dial, the journal that published the essays and reviews and philosophies on religion of the Transcendentalists, which other literary journals at the time rejected as being far too radical and outside of the realm of what people would be interested in. But probably her most significant contribution to the Transcendentalist world was her bookstore, the Elizabeth Palmer Peabody West Street Bookstore. The building still exists and has been marked in Boston as a historical site. There, she introduced the power elite of Boston to ideas of the larger world through the foreign books and the journals that she stocked, and it's where Margaret Fuller held her famous conversations. Margaret Fuller was, I think you could say, the driving force of the Transcendentalist ideas among the women in Boston. Fuller, again, as we heard in the reading, was early proponent of feminism and believed that providing education to women was vitally important. She organized these conversations, salon-type setting for women to discuss the arts, history, literature, nature, and human rights. Her goal with these conversations was to stimulate women's minds and educate them to be able to talk, this is interesting, to be able to talk intellectually with their husbands on the major issues of the day so their husbands would respect them and take care of them. Her writings, she wrote several articles and books, her writings caught the attention of Horace Greeley, who hired her to be a reporter for his New York Tribune. She was probably the first woman reporter in the country. And guided by her transcendentalist ideas, she focused her reporting on dealing with the issues of the wretched living conditions of the poor in New York and the bad treatment of the inmates in the New York prisons. In 1845, she published a tract entitled Women in the 19th Century, in which she argued on transcendentalist principles for the economic and psychological equality of the sexes. The book's first printing was sold out within a week, and is said to have inspired the 1848 Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, New York. Her conversations and books and essays influenced many other women, like abolitionist Mary White Lowell, wife of William Russell Lowell, and that Maria actually convinced to become an abolitionist. Sophia Dana Ripley, who helped found the Utopian Society Brook Farms, and women rights activists Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucy Strong. Lydia Child was another one of these transcendentalist women. Her picture's on the front of the order of service. People know her as the person who wrote the poem, The New England Boys' Song About Thanksgiving Day, more commonly known as Over the River and Through the Wood. Okay. By the way, the original poem song had people going to grandfather's, not grandmother's house, and the sleigh went through the wood, not the woods. So think about that next time we sing it. She was an avid abolitionist. In 1833, she published a tract called An Appeal in Favor of That Class of Americans Called Africans, which was a radical argument for the immediate emancipation of the slaves without compensation to the slaveholders. If you recall in history, one of the big debates was how slaveholders could be compensated if the slaves were free. And so in 1833, she was saying, they don't get any money for holding humans as slaves. She founded and was the editor of the National Anti-Slavery Standard, which was the official weekly newspaper of the American Anti-Slavery Society, that published from 1840 to the ratification of the 15th Amendment in 1870. She also produced children's books, a two-volume study of women throughout history, and a 3-volume treatise, The Progress of Religious Ideas Through Successive Ages, that she said was for the purpose of removing superstitious rubbish from the sublime morality of Christ, and that also tried to bring in the idea that there was value in all of the world's religions. Oh, by the way, Lucy is the person who William Ellery Channing credits with making him a strong and vocal abolitionist. He would go to her house, they would debate, and finally he said, she is right, and he became the strong abolitionist in the latter part of his career. And then there was Sarah Moore Grimke, who published tracts and books making the argument for women's equality and condemning the Christian churches for being prejudiced against African Americans and women. Very, very radical in that time. Her writings gave suffrage workers such as Lucy Stone, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Lucretia Mott many of the arguments that they went on to use in their speeches on women's suffrage. Edna Dow Little Hale Cheney worked to provide freed slaves with opportunities for education and training. She helped to establish the New England Hospital for Women and Children, and then went on to work to provide physicians to train women to be physicians. She was one of the organizers in 1867 of the Free Religious Society, described by its founders as an organization to emancipate religion from the dogmatic traditions advocating freedom of individual thought in religion. In the mid-1800s, this was a huge controversial issue within the Unitarian circles because these were Unitarians that were believing in giving up the Unitarian Church for freedom of thought. And then there was Carolyn Healy Dahl, who founded the American Social Science Association, and UNA, a journal devoted to women's rights. And there was the lecturer and abolitionist and suffragette Julia Ward Howe, who actualized her transcendentalist ideas through the founding of the American Women's Suffrage Association. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who co-organized the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls in 1848, and then with Susan B. Anthony founded the National Women's Suffrage Association. Her 3 volumes of the history of history of women's suffrage and her Women's Bible championed a strong secular state and urged women to recognize how religious orthodoxy and masculine theology had obstructed their chances to achieve their self-sovereignty. Now, though these women and many other voices lived 150 years ago, they are still important role models for women and for men today. Now, while Transcendentalism faded in the mid-19th century, its message of equality, freedom, the power of nature, the value of the arts is still pertinent in our times when those values are under attack in many quarters. I would speculate that these Transcendentalist women, if they were sitting here with Julia, and you can imagine them here in the front pews, if they were sitting here, they would be up here then telling us that it is our duty to listen to our inner selves, to take on major social issues, plug for our social action committee, get involved with them. And we are to work with all of our devotion to bring to real fruition the promises of freedom and equality for all races and opportunity for all people that they themselves had started to work for so many years ago. These were truly remarkable women, and we should be proud that they were part of our religious heritage. And may we do them proud in our work, in our time, to better society going forward. So be it.